The first thing people noticed was the silence, because when the men pushed her and laughed, she did not shout, she did not argue, she simply stood there with tired eyes and dust on her coat, and for a moment it looked as if the world had already taken everything from her. The street was quiet except for their rough voices and the distant sound of cars passing by. One of the men grabbed her bag and tossed it aside like it meant nothing. Another one laughed and said that women like her should learn to keep their heads down. People nearby slowed for a moment, then looked away, because everyone in that part of the city knew who those men worked for. They belonged to Viktor Malenkov, a powerful businessman who controlled half the district, a man whose name was spoken carefully, almost in whispers, the kind of man who never appeared directly but whose shadow was everywhere. His clubs, his security companies, his expensive black cars moving slowly through the streets, and the men in front of her were part of that shadow, loud, confident, certain that nothing in this world could ever touch them. The woman quietly picked up her bag from the ground, brushed the dust from her coat, and said nothing. One of the men stepped closer and looked into her face, trying to see fear, but her eyes were calm, tired, but calm, and that calmness somehow annoyed him more than anger would have. So he pushed her again and told her to remember who owned this street. She lowered her gaze slightly and nodded once, not in agreement, just in acknowledgement. Then she walked away slowly, leaving the men laughing behind her. They thought it was another small victory in another ordinary day. They did not know that the quiet woman they had just humiliated carried a past heavier than any threat they had ever faced. Her name was Elena Morozova. And once, many years ago, she had lived a very different life, a life that required silence, patience, and strength that most people would never understand. But that life had ended suddenly after a mission that changed everything. She had lost friends that night, good people who never came back, and after that she disappeared from the world she once knew, choosing a quieter existence far from secrets and orders. She moved to this city because it was supposed to be ordinary. A place where no one asked questions, where she could work a simple job, drink coffee in the morning, and walk home without thinking about danger. But power has a way of reaching everywhere, and Viktor Malenkov's influence had slowly grown until even quiet streets like this one belonged to him. Elena had tried to ignore it. She kept her head down. She worked at a small repair shop owned by an old mechanic who trusted her. And every evening she walked home past the same buildings, the same broken streetlights, the same men leaning against black cars. She never spoke to them and they never noticed her. Until the day they did, until the day boredom and arrogance made them decide that the quiet woman walking alone would be easy entertainment. That day she returned to her small apartment and sat by the window for a long time. The room was simple, almost empty, a small table, a kettle, a narrow bed, the kind of place that looked temporary even after months of living there. She made tea slowly and stared at the steam rising from the cup. Outside the city continued moving like nothing had happened, people talking, cars passing, lights turning on one by one, and yet something deep inside her felt heavy, not anger, not even fear, just a quiet sadness, because she had hoped that life like this could remain peaceful. She had hoped she would never again need the skills she once carried like armor. The next morning she returned to work as usual. The mechanic greeted her with a tired smile and asked if she could help fix an old truck engine. She nodded and spent hours working with quiet focus, her hands steady, her movements careful and precise. The day passed slowly and normally. But when evening came and she stepped outside, the same men were waiting again, leaning against the same car, smoking and laughing loudly. They saw her immediately and their smiles widened. One of them clapped slowly as if greeting an old friend. Another asked if she had missed them. Elena stopped for a moment and looked at them calmly, then continued walking without answering. They followed her for a few steps, mocking her silence, making cruel jokes, until finally they grew bored and returned to their car. It continued like this for several days. Small humiliations, quiet threats, the kind of harassment meant to remind someone that they were powerless. And each evening Elena returned home and sat by the window with her tea, thinking carefully, not about revenge, but about patience, because patience had once saved her life more than once, and she understood something those men did not. Powerful people always believe they are untouchable, and that belief slowly makes them careless. A week later something changed. Elena noticed new cars parked near the street corner. expensive ones, men in dark suits stepping in and out of a nearby restaurant that had recently been renovated. Whispers began spreading through the neighborhood. Viktor Malenkov himself had started visiting the area, meeting partners, planning new business. The mechanic at the shop muttered that when powerful men start gathering like that, trouble usually follows. Elena listened quietly while tightening a bolt on the truck engine, her face calm, her mind working slowly and carefully. Days passed and she continued watching without being noticed. Patterns appeared the way they always do. Who arrived first, who stayed late, who guarded the doors. One evening as she walked past the restaurant, one of the gangsters recognized her again and blocked her path. He smelled of alcohol and arrogance. He laughed loudly and said that maybe the quiet woman should come inside and learn how real people live. The others laughed behind him. Elena looked at him for a moment, her expression unchanged, then stepped aside and walked past without touching him. He shouted something rude after her, but she did not turn around. That night she did something she had not done in many years. She opened an old metal box hidden at the back of her closet. Inside were a few photographs, an old badge, and a phone that had not been used for a very long time. She sat on the edge of the bed holding it for several minutes, remembering voices, remembering cold nights, remembering the people who once trusted her completely. Finally she turned the phone on. The screen flickered slowly to life. The number she dialed was short and simple, the kind of number that once connected to places ordinary citizens never saw. The voice that answered was older than she remembered but still steady. There was a long pause after she said her name. Then the man quietly asked if she was safe. Elena looked out the window at the dim streetlights and answered that she was for now. She explained very little, just enough, and when the call ended she placed the phone back in the box and closed it gently. The next days seemed normal again. The gangsters still laughed and mocked, still believed the quiet woman was weak. Viktor Malenkov continued arriving in his dark car, surrounded by bodyguards and expensive perfume, shaking hands with officials who pretended not to see the fear around them. But small changes were beginning beneath the surface. Unfamiliar faces started appearing near the district, men who looked like tourists, but watched everything carefully. Black vans parked a little too long near certain buildings. Elena continued her routine exactly the same. Work, tea, quiet walks home. Patience, always patience. Then one cold evening everything moved suddenly. Police sirens echoed through the streets. Cars blocked intersections. Officers rushed into the restaurant while shocked customers stepped aside. Viktor Malenkov was led out in handcuffs, shouting angrily while cameras flashed from every direction. The same gangsters who once laughed at the quiet woman now stood frozen beside their car, pale and confused. None of them noticed Elena watching from the far side of the street. Her coat pulled close against the wind, her face calm as always. She turned away before anyone could recognize her, walking slowly toward the darker end of the road. And for the first time in many months the city felt quiet again. Not because fear had disappeared completely, but because arrogance had finally met consequences. Elena returned to her small apartment, placed the kettle on the stove, and sat by the window with her tea. The same simple room, the same narrow bed, the same quiet evening, yet something inside her felt lighter. She did not celebrate, she did not smile, she simply breathed slowly and allowed the silence to return. Because sometimes justice does not arrive with loud speeches or dramatic victories, sometimes it arrives quietly, after patience, after sadness, after long nights of waiting, and by the time the world notices, the balance has already been restored.